Have you ever had a stuffy nose that felt so clogged up that it was almost impossible to breathe? And while dealing with this incredibly annoying feeling, have you ever gone to a CVS or a Walgreens or dug through your medicine drawer to find the one thing that can immediately grant you the relief you so desperately want? I think most people have. However, what many people probably don't know is that these nasal sprays, brand name Afrin, along with many other generic iterations, not only makes their condition worse in the long run, but can and has led to a crippling cycle of addiction that for many is next to impossible to stop. And thanks to our friends at the FDA and of course the legal system, the makers of this over-the-counter drug are doing absolutely nothing about it. Hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about the nasal spray known as Afrin, a freely available medicine that most people would think benign and harmless, but has a dark side which, in my opinion, doesn't get talked about enough. We're going to talk about the harms of this drug, as well as why it's still allowed on store shelves, and the many attempts to hold the makers of it responsible. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. But before we begin, we need to thank today's sponsor, Bayer. That's a joke. They're absolutely going to hate this video, but I have to get my kicks in while I'm still breathing. So let's rewind to give you some context as to how all of this drama came to be. On February 18, 2005, the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a lower court's decision in favor of Bayer AG, the multinational pharmaceutical corporation, setting an impactful precedent that protects medicine manufacturers from major class action lawsuits and FDA regulatory crackdowns. In other words, the court's decision ensured further immunity to pharmaceutical corporations. In Kelso versus the Bayer Corporation, plaintiff Ted Kelso brought a products liability suit against Bayer, specifically a failure to warn claim, alleging that his extended use of neosynephrine, a nasal spray, had resulted in permanent nasal damage and necessitated multiple surgical procedures. Kelso argued that Bayer failed to adequately warn consumers about the long-term risks of nasal tissue damage associated with prolonged use. Bayer's response? Well, of course, that their FDA-compliant warnings were adequate, and therefore, they bore no responsibility to highlight or emphasize potential consequences of misuse, even in cases where such misuse is common or foreseeable. So Kelso argued in court that this neosynephrine, or brand name Afrin, is responsible for a lot of damage to his nose, but Bayer is saying that the warning is right there on the label. So what is the warning on the neosynephrine label? Well, buried in the middle of the product's label, it plainly states, quote, "Do not use this product for more than 3 days. Frequent or prolonged use may cause nasal congestion to recur or worsen." And of course, by plainly states, I mean you need a microscope and extremely steady hands to be able to see the warning. A warning which, if you ask Bayer, is critical to be aware of if you're going to put one of these up your nose and pull the trigger. Now, I'm sure that the topic we're talking about today is fairly reminiscent to a lot of you. I mean, most people I know have an uncle who couldn't quit using nose spray for a time. But at what point does an addiction turn from a minor nuisance to a serious public health concern? Companies like Bayer are hoping that point never comes, and admittedly, it feels like it never will. The Kelso versus Bayer court ruling occurred over a decade ago, and yet the dependency on over-the-counter nasal decongestions remains disturbingly underreported and underpublicized. See, for topical decongestions like nasal sprays, the active ingredient doing the heavy lifting is oxymetazoline hydrochloride. This ingredient works by stimulating receptors in the mucous membrane of the nose, causing the vasoconstriction and temporary relief of nasal congestion, effectively opening up the vessels in your nose for a period of time. And according to a 2022 review done by Healthline, Afrin was selected as the overall best over-the-counter nasal spray. Within this article describing the medicine, a short sentence states, quote, "Afrin can be habit-forming." See, Afrin is intended for short-term use only, and prolonged exposure to Afrin leads to a condition known as rhinitis medicamentosa, which is a complicated way of saying rebound congestion. See, rebound congestion is the habit part of habit forming that Healthline is warning about. When used longer than the recommended 3 consecutive days, the effectiveness of the ingredient, oxymetazoline, begins to diminish. And because the blood vessels in the nose become accustomed to Afrin's artificially induced construction, once the drug wears off, they begin to dilate more aggressively. Or, in layman's terms, since the vessels in your nose are used to the drug making them constrict and force mucus out, when it doesn't have the drug, they're more prone to opening up even wider than before. Which means your stuffy nose, yeah, it's worse than it was before, prompting people to use the spray again and again, establishing a physiological dependency, or in other words, an addiction. And common symptoms of Afrin addiction withdrawal include headaches, nausea, agitation, and insomnia, to name a few. Or at least, headaches, nausea, and insomnia. If I was going through all of those things, I feel the agitation would come naturally. But as annoying as all those symptoms are, there's a far more sinister side effect of Afrin. And that would be the side effect that makes it feel like you can't breathe. That's right, a nasal spray meant to clear your nasal passage and help you breathe actually rewires your nasal tissue's behavior, tricking your brain into believing you're suffocating without it. While it's not traditionally classified along with more notoriously abused substances like opioids and alcohol, Afrin addiction resembles the same behavioral hallmarks of addictive patterns. And to clarify, it's not that the drug makes you unable to breathe through your nose. You can still breathe through it just fine. But because your nose is so used to working so much better under the drug, then people who are coming off of Afrin feel like they can't breathe through their nose for a while, which makes them feel like they're too congested, which makes them want to get rid of the congestion, which makes them come back to the spray. To give you an idea of how damaging these effects can be, a clinical case report published in 2024 documented one of the first formal diagnoses of oxymetazoline use disorder, or Afrin addiction, in which a 44-year-old woman had used Afrin multiple times a day for 20 years. 20 years straight of shoving nose spray into your nose. Because one day you just had a little bit of congestion and wanted to get rid of it, and then you continue to do that for 20 years straight. At some point, you have to be a little impressed. I don't think I've ever been committed to anything that much. I think if I just had to go 20 years straight to breathe through my nose, I would just quit doing that. There's a dedication to that level of addiction. I respect it. See, this case outlined not only the physical symptoms consistent with rebound congestion, but also psychological distress, withdrawal anxiety, and compulsive behavior surrounding her use of the nasal spray. This woman had begun using Afrin in 2003 for allergic rhinitis, or in other words, hay fever. The woman then developed rebound congestion, which progressed to oxymetazoline use disorder. As of the date of publication of the case report, the subject was still receiving care at a residential addiction treatment center and is, to the study's knowledge, the first reported case of oxymetazoline use disorder lasting 20 years. And that's the thing. We don't even know how prevalent the addiction truly is because, unfortunately, an untold number of Afrin users who are suffering from rebound congestion do not have the resources to receive professional care. And due to the lack of general public awareness, they may not even realize what's happening to them, or the sad reality that they are anything but alone. I mean, like I said, a lot of us probably have a family member who takes Afrin constantly. And if your uncle's been on it for the past couple years, he does not think he has a drug addiction. He simply thinks, I just breathe better when I'm on it, and that's why he's done it every day for, again, several years. Public forums such as Reddit have allowed community building and provide a safe haven where users can share their experiences, but not everyone knows to look for resources like these. In the subreddit r/mildly interesting, one user posted a photograph of, no joke, 45 empty and partially used Afrin bottles they found in their spouse's purse. Not the medicine cabinet, not the trash can, in their purse. Once again, 45, that's dedication with a purpose. The conversation that followed prompted displays of sympathy, empathy, and many confessions from Reddit users of their own failed attempts to quit. And when it comes to Afrin and other nasal sprays, this is sadly a common thread. Dependence on oxymetazoline often develops under the radar, both for the user and their healthcare providers. What begins as a benign remedy for a seemingly acute congestion slowly develops into a compulsion bolstered by the rebound cycle, easy access, and minimal regulation of the drug. This isn't just a lack of discipline or poor self-control, it's natural human behavior mixed with a serious chemical reaction betrayed by what appears to be an unassuming and harmless little bottle. In other words, it's not that people are knowingly abusing Afrin. On the contrary, they're using it exactly how they think they should, which is until their congestion goes away. And in most cases, it's hard to blame people who get addicted to it because, if for no other reason, there's simply no education about it. Think about it this way. I went in for a surgery a couple years ago, and as I was going into the surgery, I was given a dose of Valium. And I went from worried, scared out of my mind because I was going to be put under, to the happiest I have ever been. My memory is hazy, but I think at one point, one of the nurses asked if I could, stand up or lean up or something like that. And I think I said, whatever you say, doctor lady, or whatever. I was on cloud 9. And after the surgery, I thought to myself, man, it's a good thing that that's a controlled substance, because if I could just get that whenever I wanted, I would have a problem. Because when it comes to Valium, that's a big deal. But no one thinks of nose spray as being a problem. I've used nose spray before when I had allergies, and thankfully I didn't get addicted, but it was literally walking into a Walgreens, buying it, clearing up my nose for a bit, and then moving on with my day. Thank God I didn't have allergies for another 48 hours, or I could still be addicted to it from something that happened when I was like 14. And because people don't know that it can be addictive, it's really just a Pavlovian response. My nose feels stuffed. I'm going to spray something into my nose. I feel better now. Oh, problem comes back, I will spray into my nose again. And then you keep doing that for 20 years. Unfortunately, the effects of rebound congestion make the user think the illness persists, which means the medication itself is causing the very problem it claims to fix. Which you think would be grounds to force them to change the formula, or ban Afrin altogether, or at the absolute bare minimum, make it abundantly, overwhelmingly clear what the restrictions are on its use and what the consequences are if you do not adhere to them. I mean, we do that with a ton of other drugs, right? Any pain medication has a ton of warnings on it that they can become addictive, to the point that it's common knowledge now to not get hooked on pain meds. But of course, none of this is the case with Afrin. To cite Kelso versus Bayer from earlier, Afrin is under no legal obligation to use the term rebound congestion. They prefer to label it as quote-unquote habit. You know, habits, biting your fingernails, brushing your teeth before bedtime, taking 5 to 6 hits of a nasal medication for 20 years. All just habits, because, why not? And looking this stuff up online, it's not hard to find a ton of people who have had bad experiences with the drug. As a matter of fact, one user from the board I mentioned earlier, r/mildly interesting, said, quote, "As someone that used this daily for like 15 years straight, do not recommend. Your sinuses feel like they're closing if you don't use it every few hours. Once you step into Afrin menthol territory, you literally feel like you're dying without it. A lengthy hospital stay due to something completely unrelated made it impossible to use it, so after some shitty withdrawals, I haven't looked back since, and feel fine besides being annoyed during allergy season." Another post in the same thread describes the psychological effects of rebound congestion, admitting that they stash multiple bottles of nasal spray in their car, in office drawers at work, medicine cabinets, and overnight bags in case they go on a last-minute trip, noting that the fear of a potential nasal obstruction has a serious grip over their daily planning and routines. In the same thread, a commenter who claims to be a pulmonary doctor says the medication should be banned. And again, it's Reddit, so I guess this person could just be lying, but what they said, after everything we've established, isn't that far-fetched. In it, this alleged pulmonary doctor says, quote, "It works for 48 hours, but then when you stop, the rebound nasal congestion is terrible. Then, because your congestion sucks, you use it again. But then when you stop it, it comes back worse. Best way to do this is just stop it completely. The congestion should get terrible, then resolve. If the nasal congestion comes back eventually, use different agents depending on what the diagnosis is." End quote. In a news segment from Cleveland's WKYC Channel 3, one interviewee described the mental toll of the physiological effects of Afrin addiction, saying she found herself unable to breathe to the point of becoming panicked. When that story was uploaded to YouTube, a commenter wrote, quote, "The worst part about being addicted to these is waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for air because both nostrils are plugged. It's quite scary." This problem is so real that there is even an entire subreddit dedicated to the addiction called r/quit Afrin, which has 3,054 members. Not bad. In one post, a user described their decade-plus dependency to Afrin with, quote, "The last 10 years have been absolutely ridiculous. I use it literally every hour of the day. You will do anything to breathe. It's like a ball and chain, and I'm starting to realize now that my obsession with having a clear nose has generally made me an unhappier person in general. I quit back in 2020 cold turkey. It was hell for the first 3 nights and I hardly slept, but it did work. But within a few months, I was slowly getting back on it again." If you just remove the context from some of these quotes, by the way, it sounds like people describing heroin. But no, it's a nasal spray that they bought with like their family on like a Tuesday. But for real, there's just so many people talking about being hardcore addicted to this stuff for years and years and years. I mean, listen to some of these statements. Quote, "I would have to use it so much I would get nosebleeds daily. I would tear the house apart if I couldn't find a bottle, and if I couldn't get any more spray out of the bottle, I would unscrew the cap with the straw and stick the straw as far up my nose as possible, hoping to get any remnants of nasal spray into my nose." Another quote says, quote, "My nose was always red and chapped from blowing it all the time, and my sense of smell went away. I suspected it was the Afrin, and I was right, as eventually, when I stopped, my smell came back." Another quote says, "My husband gets pissed off at me when I bring up the nose spray. He can't even stop using it for a week. During the week, he tries to prove he's not addicted by putting it down, but the ENT said that his deviated septum is by far the worst case he's ever seen in his life. He's had to have a few teeth pulled because his sinus cavity was eaten away and the roots of his teeth were in his sinus cavity. He refuses to even admit he has a problem. He goes through a bottle of Afrin every few days, so it's bad." I once again cannot stress to you how much this sounds like meth. Stacy Krause, a personal trainer who lived in New York City at the time, recalls a particularly troubling moment during a first date that made her realize her Afrin dependency. She says, quote, "About 2 minutes after we met, we had to walk to the store so that I could pick up a bottle. I felt like a junkie." End quote. Krause's admission is consistent with other users' inability to go throughout their day without feeling the need to use Afrin and other nasal spray products. And so you might hear all of this and be like, well, that's awful that all of this information's coming to light now, as in just now. And surely this hasn't been happening for a really long time and the stories have just been obfuscated and covered up, right? Well, of course, you're wrong. An article in the New York Times published in 1981 indicated that there was an increasing number of people becoming heavily reliant on nasal sprays. Dr. Malcolm Chevet, an ENT specialist in Manhattan, estimated that he saw 150 to 200 patients a year who had become dependent on nasal sprays. A few years earlier, in 1976, a panel of scientists told the FDA that, quote, "There is a tendency on the part of patients to administrate nasal decongestants too frequently and for too long a time," end quote. And in the very same article, published over 4 decades ago, it states that, quote, "Some physicians feel that the labeling of nasal sprays should be changed to underscore the importance of not exceeding the recommended dosage," end quote. So this is something that the medical field has been aware of for over 40 years. They've also been trying to warn the FDA and the general public about the dangers of it. But even back in 1981, there was little hope for anything to be done about this. Again, from the Times article, quote, "The Food and Drug Administration is not expected to suggest labeling changes in the near future, and if changes were suggested, they would be resisted by the industry," end quote. So that's obviously not good. Medical experts and pharmaceutical companies have known about this for decades, and there have been several stories from back then up until now of the nasal spray damaging people's lives. And speaking of the effects of this nasal spray, how bad are the long-term effects? Well, beyond immediate nasal congestion, extended Afrin use has been known to cause severe structural and physiological damage to the nasal cavity, and occasionally contribute to systemic health risks such as mucosal damage and turbinate hypertrophy. Or in other words, chronic exposure to oxymetazoline restricts blood flow, which can lead to injury, inflammation, and hypertrophy of the turbinates, which is the bone and soft tissue in the nose that is critical for regulating airflow and humidifying inhaled air. More often than not, these structural damages enlarge to the point where they obstruct the nasal passage, requiring patients to undergo reduction via surgery. But even these operations are not without risk, and patients can find themselves on a lifelong and costly journey with these surgical procedures. In other words, not only can it make you feel like you can't breathe temporarily while you're in the early stages of the drug's effect, but it can permanently damage your nose and airways forever. One patient recounted before their turbinate reduction operation, quote, "There's a potential that I might have to have the operation every 5 to 10 years for the rest of my life." To give you an idea of just how severe prolonged Afrin usage can be, one surgical patient describes their initial consultation and the first question they were asked following their nasal examination. Because as soon as the doctor took a look at them, the first question the doctor asked was, quote, "How long have you been using cocaine? Because it looks like you've been doing it every week since you were 18. Over decades, long-term Afrin use has been linked to a breakdown in what's called mucociliary clearance, a vital defense mechanism within the airways to protect our bodies from harmful particles and infections. When this process fails, it contributes to respiratory diseases like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, and asthma. In some severe cases, ENT specialists have discovered fibrosis and scarring of the mucous membranes, resulting in a permanent reduction in nasal function. So yeah, it can permanently damage your nose, affecting your sense of smell, your breathing capacity, and overall health of your upper respiratory system. But wait, it gets even worse. Because one of the many side effects of Afrin is also high blood pressure. One post online detailed the harrowing effects of someone's 19-year use, with, quote, "I have a close friend who used that stuff about every 15 minutes to relieve the effects of a deviated septum," He did this for exactly 19 years and then suffered a massive stroke at the age of 45. No family history of strokes, and today he still can't speak, has trouble walking, and suffers seizures. The doctors didn't blame everything on the Afrin, but if you read the label, it mentions issues with high blood pressure, which of course certainly didn't help. While the FDA classifies Afrin as safe for short-term use, this does not factor in patients with underlying heart and blood conditions. One extreme, high-profile case involved an 8-year-old child who experienced cardiac arrest after being administered Afrin pre-operatively. Mackenzie Bryant of Seattle was left with permanent brain damage following this episode. The family filed a lawsuit against the University of Washington and Seattle Children's Hospital and won a $15 million settlement. This is the closest that Bayer AG has ever come to losing a legal battle over this drug. And it wasn't even them that lost the legal battle, it was the hospital that administered the drug. But I mean, you can't be that surprised. After all, they include a warning on the package, so they're covered. You see that? It says to ask your doctor if you have high blood pressure. Clearly, in size like 0 font. Because of the physiological and psychological challenges users face with rebound congestion, it is extremely challenging for patients to stop using Afrin and other oxymetazoline-based nasal sprays, especially because the heavy symptoms aren't as immediately apparent as they are with some controlled substances. Most people think they're fine until it's too late. Online forums and social media have given platforms for users to share their experience, offer support, and build awareness through the power of community. These informal environments are in large part due to the absence of any institutional acknowledgement. Curtis Arnold Hammer posted his experience on TikTok and said he expected, quote, a few comments from people calling me an idiot and saying, well, you should have read the box. What I wasn't ready for, he says, was tens of thousands of people who are in the same situation as me. According to Dr. Raj Sindwani, an ENT specialist in Cleveland, he states, quote, this is a true addiction. It is a psychological and physical dependence on this. So it can be a real challenge to get off these sprays once you've been on them for a prolonged period of time. And again, most of the education from this is coming from social media. I guarantee there are several people watching this video who have taken Afrin before and never heard about any of these negative effects until you clicked on this video. So you're welcome, I guess. Yahtzee. The main treatment for Afrin and oxymetazoline dependency depends on the severity of the addiction and the patient's tolerance to discomfort. Simplest method, going cold turkey, is often intolerable for patients due to the severity of rebound symptoms. Generally, quitting cold turkey might cause nasal misery in excess of a week. And the first 72 hours are reported as the worst period of swelling. Users can often expect mouth breathing, sinus pressure, and insomnia. Many people on Reddit report using sleep aids, humidifiers, and antihistamines to survive this week of hell. Or in other words, as with everything else, more irritation. But, being irritated for 3 to 7 days is probably better than your nose no longer working forever. Another treatment is to taper off use by reducing use to once per day, one nostril at a time, and gradually increasing the time between doses. Paired with a steroid nasal spray like Flonase, for example, a patient's nasal passage can eventually normalize after 3 to 6 weeks. That is, if they stick to the regimen. And with everything we've talked about today, it is pretty crazy when you consider that despite all of these horror stories and the piles of evidence of dependency and physical harm associated with the stuff, that efforts to hold manufacturers accountable have been mostly unsuccessful. And to have the FDA turn a blind eye, or blind nose, to all of this might be even worse. So what can be done? And to an extent, it starts with awareness, and medical professionals at the clinical level can prove to be an especially helpful aid. While it's not officially, or at least not officially yet, listed in the DSM-5, many clinicians advocate for recognizing chronic topical decongestion dependency within the broader spectrum of behavioral addictions, due to the compulsive nature and the degree to which they can interfere with daily functions. And moreover, increasing public alarm to just how addictive things like opioids or benzodiazepines like Xanax and other stimulants gives hope that we're becoming more vigilant about dangers like these, and hopefully videos like this one help spread and shape that awareness. It is an uphill battle though. The fact is, Afrin and other over-the-counter medications that are sold without a prescription, age restriction, or pharmacist consultation help perpetuate the misperception that they're perfectly safe because they're accessible. Afrin's prominent placement on pharmacy shelves, availability in multi-packs, and omission of aggressive warning language adds to the notion that oxymetazoline is harmless. This creates a situation where dependency can form undetected and unchallenged. In pop culture, shows like Family Guy and comedian Nate Bargatze's opening monologue on SNL have touched on nasal spray addiction, lending humor to the issue while showing how widespread it really is. Everyday people, nurses, students, moms, anyone can find themselves going from a head cold to posting confessions on Reddit at 1 in the morning in no time. And unlike, say, an opioid addiction, which benefits from a robust framework of medical and therapeutic treatments, oxymetazoline dependency is scarcely discussed in clinical settings. Although the precedent set in the aftermath of the case we talked about at the beginning of this video, Kelso versus Bayer AG, basically shields the manufacturer from any legal recourse, a recent complaint, Orso versus the Bayer Corporation, asks the question of whether it is Bayer's duty to inform physicians of the specific symptoms of their products. Quote, Bayer's instruction to ask a doctor if symptoms persist beyond 3 days on the label gives rise to a duty to warn physicians directly, presumably so the physician can pass these warnings along to their patients when consulted in accordance with the labeling. End quote. But despite reports from clinicians and consumers, Bayer has made no substantive changes to its packaging or public messaging, nor has the FDA updated its labeling requirements beyond the 3-day use warning. There is no black box warning, no visual risk indicator, and no consumer outreach effort designed to raise awareness of the drug's potential harm. You know, it's funny how when the FDA has a product that they don't explicitly have their hands in, things like cigarettes, for example, that they require them to put giant labels on the package that say, smoking kills, or smoking is highly addictive, don't start. Literally labels on the box telling you to not use the thing that's inside of the box. But when it comes to a drug they're moderating, the goalpost moves. It's, oh, well, we just need to tell them to talk to a doctor about it sometimes. We don't actually have to tell the doctors what it does, right? And to clarify, I'm not saying that Afrin is more or even as dangerous as smoking, of course. But if this is well within their purview, then maybe just a label that's a little bit larger or just saying can be addictive would help. Also, if my mom watches this, I definitely only purchased this to make a point in this video. No other reason. Afrin addiction exemplifies a larger issue: the cultural and federal regulators' failure to account for how non-prescription drugs can be misused in deeply harmful ways. Afrin is marked as a remedy, but for some it becomes the affliction. And it raises a deeper issue. How many other addictions are we ignoring simply because the bottle doesn't come with a street name or prescription pad, or, giant letters that say it's going to kill you? While technically complying with safety standards, the product's marketing, packaging, and accessibility are indicators of a system that prioritizes consumer convenience and commercial viability. Or in other words, the usual culprit: money. Money over public health. And until anything is done to address the problem through stronger labeling, pharmacist-led interventions, or educational campaigns, Afrin dependency will likely remain a widespread but invisible affliction, hidden behind a pharmacy aisle and masked by the illusion of safety. And the point of this video isn't even to be like, never use Afrin under any circumstances. It is a vasoconstrictor. There are scenarios where you may need that. But just like in my reference earlier with the Valium before I had a surgery, just know that you're dealing with a dangerous substance. Every day, most of us encounter substances like alcohol or nicotine, and for a lot of us, it never becomes a problem. But that doesn't mean it can't become a problem for a lot of people. So just be aware and be smart about what you shove up your nose. Or don't if you don't want to. I'm just a YouTuber, and I'm just thankful you stuck around until this long into the video, and I just want to say thank you for watching. This has always been an interesting topic to me because, like I said, I know at least 3 people in my life who I've seen carry around a bottle of Afrin and never really thought about the implications of it until I started thinking about this video topic. So again, thank you to all the researchers and writers who put this information together and made this video possible. All of their links and information will be in the description below. Be sure to show them some love because this channel would not exist as it is without them. Thank you all so much for the support you've shown on the videos over here. I'm certainly having fun with it, and I'm glad that you all are as well. And thank you so much for the love you've already shared. More videos on the way, and that should do it for now, but we just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. And also, once again, don't shove stuff up your nose unless you really want to.